Okay, thanks everyone for joining today. Andy and I are super excited about this talk, and as I was just discussing, I think the aim of today is to make it a very practical session. Yes, we are going to touch on the latest research and what is being shown in the research to be occurring with high-level athletes, and then filtering down to age group and weekend warriors and what's possible in terms of performance and also health. So we'll get into it. I'll let Andy introduce himself. He doesn't look like that at the moment. He's got glorious locks, and we were discussing his hair the other day, but I'll let Andy talk more about himself.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. The hair's is a side effect of lockdown that just hasn't been rectified yet, much to the amusement and dismay of my family and people around me, but I'm rolling with it for the time being. Very, very quick part of history on my background is I studied sport and exercise science. I also was I describe myself as a bad professional triathlete, but a pretty good age group triathlete. I got top 10 in a few Ironman races and podiumed in a couple of 70.3s back around the sort of early 2000s. But what really got me into the field of hydration initially was my own failings as an athlete. I would typically race really well in cold conditions and would always suffer in the heat. And it was a long journey for me in terms of learning about hydration and electrolyte replacement that led me to found Precision Hydration about 12 years ago, which has now become Precision Fuelin Hydration.
Perfect. And my name's Scott Tindal. I'm the co-founder of a performance nutrition app called Fuelin. My background is nutrition. I also have a master's in sports medicine and a bachelor's degree in physiotherapy, or physical therapy, as they would call it in America. I work with professional athletes all the way through to age groupers, and the Fuelin app syncs with Training Peaks in today's plan. We use we recommend products from a wide range of suppliers, and Precision Fuelin Hydration is one in particular that we really like because of the product and what it actually does and what it provides the athletes. So that's why we decided to do a session with Andy today and get into what the science and the practicalities of fueling are for athletes. So the agenda today, we were going to do talk about high carb fueling and hydration, but we decided that actually it's probably too much to cover, and depending on the reaction to today's session, we will then look at doing a follow-up to talk specifically about hydration, because obviously that's a huge area for Andy and his company as well. We'll cover daily nutrition in terms of pre and post fueling, because a lot of the high carb fueling is going to be discussing in session, and then we're going to try and bring it all together in terms of how do you actually do it from a practical standpoint. And if we do have time, we'll touch on some case studies that Andy's put together, and they're really nice to see. Okay, high carb fueling, it's pretty much the buzzword at the moment. It's the world of nutrition tends to go in cycles, and it wasn't too long ago everyone was talking about low carb fueling and high fat and the advantages of that. I think what we're about to discuss is what the research probably has been saying anyway for the last sort of 50 years, I guess, and it's just actually people are bothering to read the research now, and really there's been a bit more of an influx on the latest research dealing with carbohydrates and how it can actually benefit you as a high performing athlete. So Andy, I thought what we'd do today is, why don't we just touch on like the latest research from your point of view with regards to the products that you produce, I guess, chews, gels, fluids, and what you're seeing in the research in terms of, we can touch on this, oxidation rates, GI complaints, and then we can talk about these magical multiple transportable carbs.
Yeah, that's probably a place to start, I guess, in a way, because the concept of multi-transportable carbs came about in the research like early in the 2000s, probably, maybe even slightly into the late 1990s. And Asker Ukendrup was and remains a big name in that field, because I think part of what stimulated him looking at that area was the fact that carbohydrate intake appeared to be, or an increase in carbohydrate intake always anecdotally appeared to be linked with increased performance in a lot of elite athletes, and many elite athletes were demonstrating carbohydrate intakes which were a bit higher than what was considered to be the ceiling at the time, which was sort of around 60 grams of glucose an hour. And there was this train of research that went down the line of looking at what happens if you combine different types of carbohydrate. The popular one to combine was glucose and fructose, in order to take advantage of the fact that in the gut you can absorb, they use different channels for absorption. So the theory was potentially you could absorb more carbohydrate per unit of time by mixing together different types of carbs, and that got thoroughly lab tested. It was already being field tested and appeared to show that there was a substantial uplift. And that's when people started initially talking around the idea of up to 50% more, so 90 grams of carbohydrate an hour was typically shown to be viable in by using a multi-transportable carb like a glucose fructose mix. And really that research, you could almost consider that to be relatively old these days, but it's still a technique which we see a lot in the field with athletes, that appears to work. And this latest research, the one that you flagged when we were discussing this, Scott, this paper that looked at and the next evolution in that really was saying, okay, well, if we're using multi-transportable carbs, most of the research was done on drinks. Does it make much difference because we know that athletes use way more than carbohydrate drinks, and in fact in long distance events athletes will often rely on a lot of gels, a lot of solid foods like bars and chews and things. What difference does it make with the type of delivery format you use for those carbohydrates? And I guess cutting to the chase on that, and you can correct me if I've interpreted any of it wrong, Scott, but basically they found that the uptake and absorption and oxidation of the carbohydrate in terms of the rate it was used at was very similar across those different formats.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Andy. So what's interesting is they're looking at, and this particular research where they were looking at was a group of highly trained cyclists. So, and that's a really important point for all the triathletes out there. This research is applicable to cycling in particular. And we need to think about that, because what it doesn't take into account is the run off the bike, which could have implications on the GI complaints, which despite the athletes taking in either chews, gels, fluids, or a mix of those carbohydrates, the oxidation rates were all very similar, which is a good thing. So the higher the oxidation rate, the better it is in terms of absorption. But what they also found with these cyclists is that it didn't really matter if they were taking in chews, gels, fluids, or a mix of all those, which is probably what happens in real life. The GI complaints were still very low, which was very interesting and hasn't really been researched before in that format. So, and obviously it's one study amongst many, but it was very interesting in that GI complaints were kept to a minimum despite taking in large volumes of hypertonic solution. But maybe it was because they were taking in the mixed amounts and not just high amounts of liquid, but also, as I said, they're not actually running off the bike, which I think has to be the next evolution of research, where they're actually studying triathletes and looking at the cycle component going into the run off the bike, and then assessing what happens if someone then drinks fluids on the run, or if they take on chews, or if they take on gels, or a mix of all of those, and then look at the oxidation rates and also GI complaints. And again, I'll just talk from my experience. I tend, and Andy and I were talking about this, is I tend to recommend certainly gels and chews as first line products on the bike, with potentially some carbohydrate liquid to top up total amounts of carbohydrate. And I especially would recommend that for people who have previous history of GI complaints, where they've been drinking pretty much all their carbohydrates in order to fuel their body. Those athletes in particular who get a lot of GI complaints with that, I'll tend to take them back from using a liquid carbohydrate and then introduce gels and chews. And Andy, I don't know what your experience with that. Do you tend to do a similar thing?
Yeah, definitely. We used to be a lot more adamant in saying that we felt that the best strategy was to fuel with solid products and gels and to hydrate with very hypotonic electrolyte solutions or water. And what I would say is that the practical work that we've done in the last 5 or 6 years with a lot of particularly pro and elite athletes has shown us we've had to soften that approach a little bit, because there are a lot of people that use a vast combination, particularly in pro cycling. They'll use a lot of isotonic or hypertonic drinks to get the volume of calories in, but they tend to be, and that's exactly what this research was trying to address, was they tend to be used in conjunction in a mix with other things. And I think the times when we've seen in the case studies that we've worked on, we've got a very relevant one which hasn't been published on our website yet, but we've been working with a triathlete who's qualified for Kona this year, who's one of the favorites. She's an age group athlete who's one of the favorites to win her age group in Kona. She's had a history of having lots and lots of GI distress in middle and long distance races. In fact, it's quoted as saying that she'd not really finished a race without being sick, or at least having some kind of upper GI reflux at some point in the race. And we did a lot of back and forth on that to try and figure out why, but she was very conscientious about getting high amounts of carbs in. A lot of that was through very concentrated liquids. And what was amazing is we've worked with her to shift that intake into sort of chews and gels on the bike, still using higher carbohydrate drinks on the run because they were easier to consume. But that one difference, she was taking the same amount of carbs, changing the format, made all the difference in her last race. It was the first race she's completed without any sickness. And although that's only, and it's always important to point out with case studies and anecdote, they are, N of one quite often. They're not well-controlled scientific studies. It's a trend that we see that whilst hypertonic drinks are a really convenient way of getting a large amount of carbohydrate in easily, especially when you're breathing really hard, they don't always work for everyone. And if you are having problems, they can be a good place to start looking to replace them with more solid stuff. Now, safe in the knowledge, looking at this research, that you're not going to compromise the total amount of carbs you can get in.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Andy, is that whatever, like everything you're going to hear and everything you read and you get told online is, the numbers, 90 grams an hour, 120 grams an hour, so on. But it comes down to the athlete actually doing trial and error. And as Andy said, be the scientist, N equals 1. You have to work out what works for you. And if you do have complaints, then you've got to look at trying to tweak that. And the research is also showing that it is, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go through this, but in terms of that gut training element, there are multiple facets to gut training. There is gut training by using pre-session fueling, so large amounts of liquid prior to going and doing a session can be one form of gut training. Eating just prior to actually going and doing a session, having a stomach full or a gut full of food, can be a way of training the brain in terms of changing perception. We know that repeated efforts of doing that with either fluids or volume prior to a session can actually have a positive impact on perception and that feeling of fullness and nausea for in session. You then have your in session gut training, which again will relate to repeated and repetitive higher amounts of carbohydrates in that session at the intensity you intend to race at. And that again is a really important point. We talk about this carb fueling here, is like, I think, and again, Andy and I've talked about this multiple times, is like, you have to look at what intensity are you actually going to be performing at? Because the reality is, if you're not going to be above sort of 65-70% of your max VO2, then the reality is you may not need a lot of carbohydrates. However, if, like most triathletes or athletes, you're actually wanting to perform at your absolute best and crush each race that you go in, the likelihood is you are going to be over that 65-70% of your VO2, and therefore carbohydrates are going to be a very important fuel source for you to actually maximize your performance. And I think that point should really be emphasized, in that it's not you need carbohydrates all the time. And I think, Andy, you made a really good point about this recently, is like, think about the purpose of the session you're doing. And I mean, what would you say to that, like in terms of the purpose of this, the session that they're performing, and then, you know, when to think about using carbohydrates in that sense?
Yeah, well, I think the point that you touched on around, you know, training the gut to get ready for what you're going to throw at it on race day is one that's becoming increasingly important as people get interested in taking on more carbohydrates. Because if you immediately go in, you find one or two people who appear to have that kind of iron stomach, who can take whatever's thrown at them, and they can dial carbohydrate intake up really high right from the get-go, and it's no problem to them. But they're in the minority, and the majority of people will probably find it a bit uncomfortable at first. And so you get this idea of training the gut and taking in carbs during key training sessions in order to prepare for that. But what that doesn't need to become is a mandate to say you've got to take, and you should be taking in loads of carbohydrates every single training session that you do. When we look at a gut training plan or protocol, usually it focuses on the last 6 to 8 weeks before a major race, with using an increasing amount of carbs and fluids in the longest, hardest training sessions, but then only fueling, you know, kind of normally, sensibly, adequately around your other sessions, because it's not, we don't have to do a pendulum swing here and suddenly be over fueling everything at the same time. And that there's definitely been, like you said, not only in the last decade, there was a massive amount of interest and shift towards, in some circles, towards restricting carbohydrates, using fats and that kind of thing. We saw a load of people go swinging hard one way, like trying to minimize carb intake. And what we've got to avoid, I think, at the moment is the idea of it swinging back the other way. So as much as I'm a big believer in the fact that, you know, using carbohydrates relatively aggressively when you're working hard for a long period of time is often a huge component of top performance. It doesn't mean that you have to do it really hard all the time. It's doing it selectively, in exactly the same way as you're going to use training intensity and volume selectively to get the best results.
And that the purpose of it, like, I think it was Mark Harris and James Morton, one of his PhD students this year, they really highlighted that, in that they looked at a session in the evening. It was glycogen depleting, and then what they did is fed either of the 3 groups, they either fed them 0 carbs, a moderate amount of carbs, or a high amount of carb feed. And then what they had them do is do, I think it was a peak performance session, peak power output session the next day. And what they showed is only the group with effectively what has 300 millimoles of glycogen in the wet muscle, the group that had the high amount of carbohydrates in the evening, was the only group that could consistently produce power at the output that they intended to do. The groups that didn't consume, or consumed lower amounts of carbohydrates in the evening, or no carbohydrates, had progressive loss of wattage the next day. And the really interesting thing about what they also studied was the physiological markers. So all these markers related to fasting, where they talk about the PGC1 alpha and the AMPK, which is all to do with mitochondrial changes, and that all 3 groups still had significant changes in the expression of those markers despite having high amounts of carbohydrates. So it's now starting to even think about, okay, do we need to do a lot of fasted training to create those mitochondrial changes? Maybe not, but also if the session you're looking to do the day, like in the morning, think about having a higher carbohydrate meal at least the night before, if the purpose of that session is to absolutely smash it out of the park. Whereas if that session the next day is just a training session, you know, time on the bike, it's maybe not that important, and the coach is like, hey, I just want you to get through it, then as Andy said, like, you don't need to smash a huge amount of carbohydrates the night before. So you know, obviously in the Fuelin app we manage all that, and you know, we provide the individuals with the type of carbohydrates they're meant to do. But it is a really important takeaway for athletes to think about, is think about what you want to try and achieve in the session, and then use carbohydrates, as Andy said, accordingly. Like, not everyone needs to be smashing carbs 24/7. That, I mean, if your goal is to lose weight, then energy balance becomes a very important factor here. Like, let's not forget that in order to lose weight and body fat, you need to be in a calorie deficit. Now, that calorie deficit can be either through reduction in food intake, or it can be through a maintenance sort of caloric intake with an increase in exercise energy expenditure. And it's either one of those two that's going to put you into that caloric deficit, which is going to result in weight loss. But if you also go into that caloric deficit, be expecting that you probably won't have amazing energy all the time.
Yeah.
And I think you see that, Andy, don't you? Like, yeah, you've got to think of where your purpose is. Is it to smash the sessions out of the park, as you said, those last 6 to 8 weeks? You're dialing it in, you're practicing your race fueling, your hydration strategy, everything like that. So session output is amazing. You're not worried about losing weight at that point in time.
Yeah, it's the phrase that Morton coined a few years ago with the paper that he wrote, was like fuel for the work required, which kind of says it all really, in terms of you've got to, if the primary goal of the training session is a high level of output, or if it's a race simulation training session, then both of those scenarios warrant fueling, you know, with a large amount of carbohydrate, either pre-session, depending on the type of session, or pre-enduring if it's long and hard enough. But around that, you're right, you're absolutely right. It's about moderating it according to, you know, training outcomes and the other nutritional goals that you've got. And that's always an important point to make early on when we're talking about this, because, you know, even the title of our slides here is like, started off with like high carb fueling and all the rest of it. It can be misinterpreted into being like an all or nothing approach. And what we're really talking about is that, yeah, high performance window. I think the key takeaway though that I took from that paper that you highlighted is the fact that if you're fueling it, you can be relatively confident in using, you know, solid foods, semi-solid foods like gels, liquids, whatever. There's not a lot of, you know, as we've always said, there's not a lot of magic in what it is you're taking in. Really, it's the amount and timing, and then it comes down to, yeah, on the bike you can probably stomach more solids. On the run, it's going to be more liquids, more gels and that sort of thing, if you're a triathlete and playing around with that.
Yep, no, I agree. So I thought what we'd do is just pop in. I thought this was really good, Andy. I like what you're doing here with your website and getting people to, you know, you're providing at least a framework for people to start to think about. So these were my magical splits that I put in. I was probably a bit ambitious, but yeah. I thought what was really nice is, look, do you want to talk us through how you sort of came with this and what you're trying to do?
Yeah, so we've just launched this. This is called the Fuelin Hydration Planner. We didn't use a consulting company to come up with that name. It was sort of fairly standard. Describes, it does what it says on the tin, but it's a tool which is supposed to get people started on the journey of really figuring out what you need to take per hour during. At the moment, during a race, we haven't built a training session planner yet, but that's in the works. But to start off with, it's for a race, and it breaks it down and gives you 3 outputs, which are how much carbohydrate roughly you'll need per hour throughout the race, how much sodium in terms of your main electrolyte intake, and how much fluid, with a tolerance on those things for, you know, all the variables. It does that. It takes a load of information from you on the front end about how fast you're going to swim, ride and run, or if you're doing a single sport, how fast you're going to ride or how fast you're going to run, over what duration. And it also takes into account a bit of demographic information, which include things like your how you perceive your sweat rate, or if you actually know your sweat rate, you can put those figures in. If you know your sweat sodium concentration, those kind of things, you can put it in. And the whole point of it is to not come up with the final plan with exactly what you're going to do, but to get you in the right zone. And because we felt that, you know, as for what we do this a lot manually for athletes, and we figured there's got to be a way to get people much closer to their numbers without having to sit down and have a consultation. And of course, as you well know, in doing what you do professionally, there's always a time and a place when a one-to-one consultation or some more in-depth work is what you need to problem solve and that sort of thing. But the idea with this planner and it's totally free to use, is that it can get you in the right zone for these numbers. It can also, as you can see from your example there, it gives you an idea of whether the intakes that are being suggested are high relative to what we'd recommend for anyone, moderate or low, so we can see that. So I'm imagining on this one, to get outputs like that, you've obviously put in some pretty punchy times. That's looking like 4.5 hours for a half Ironman race. And yeah, good luck, Scott. And probably pretty big, pretty big sweat rate and warm conditions. If you run exactly the same demographic statistics for yourself through the algorithm, but then said that it was cold and you're going a bit slower, for example, it would give you a drastically reduced amount of hydration and electrolytes to take in and that sort of thing. So it's worth, I think it's worth having to play with and sort of just to help get you in the zone, because as we talked about the other day, the biggest step here is going from being someone who hasn't got a plan to someone who's got some kind of plan. Because once you've got some kind of plan, you can iterate and move it forward. And I know that that's what you spend a lot of time doing with the athletes that you work with, is taking the actual information of what they've done and then sort of moving it forward, like with your exactly like with your carb capacity testing.
Yeah, and Andy, I think it's a really nice segue into this, is that this example on the right is actually taken from what we call an autopilot athlete. So these are one of the athletes that actually I don't work with one-on-one, but the idea behind the carb capacity testing is nearly taking what Andy's provided on their website and taking it to actually be individually what you as the athlete are actually doing. So it comes down to each and every session, which is applicable. So for the way in which we do it is that if a session is over Z3 in terms of the intensity, then and over a certain duration. So I think it's over 89 minutes for a bike, or over 70, I think it's 70 minutes for the run. If it's at an intensity, then what we're asking the athletes to do is self-record what they're actually taking in. So if they were taking in, you can see they might take in their 222 grams of carbs in the bottom right-hand example over the course of the session, which works out to be around 83 grams of carbs per hour, which is around 1.3 grams per kilo body weight. You can record the signs and symptoms if you get anything. In this case, the person had 5 precision fuels and 3 packets of Cliff Blocks. So that's where they got their carbohydrate amount from. Now, with repeated testing, what the athlete can start to do is get to the numbers that Andy is suggesting, because those numbers, whether it's 90 grams or 120 grams, are achievable. In my opinion, I think everyone can get very close to those numbers through repeated efforts of doing this. So we tend to recommend at least sort of 10 plus gut training sessions, because as Andy said, like for a pro athlete, and I think it's a really good point, Andy, you said, the research shows around 10 to 11 consecutive gut training sessions has been shown to reduce GI complaints in athletes and improve carbohydrate oxidation rates, gastric emptying, so on. But the typical age grouper doesn't have that ability to do sort of lots of consecutive high intensity sessions. They tend to do their sessions on a weekend basis. And so if you think about that and you need 10 sessions, that could be 10 weeks at least out from when you're going to be doing your race. So think potentially up to 3 months before you actually do your race, you want to start thinking about doing these gut training sessions and not limiting carbohydrates, but actually going into those sessions where your coach is putting you at a race intensity and practicing taking in these amounts of carbs. And what I didn't put on here was a graph of, which is actually really nice, because, and Andy and I were talking about this, is like the athlete will tend to say, oh yeah, I take in huge amounts of carbohydrates in a session. And then they start recording it. And actually we see that they're taking in 35 grams an hour. And it's only when you see the numbers that you start to go, oh, okay. And I think you gave an example of a pro athlete the other day, didn't you, Andy, where you were like, they were saying, oh, he's cramping or something like that. He ran out of energy because of electrolyte imbalance. But what was it in the end that you found?
So we had an athlete who had done really well in an Ironman up until about 30k into the marathon, still had an overall very good result, but probably could have done better because the last 10k really, last 10 or 12k really suffered and really slowed up. And the theory was, coming straight back from the athlete's coach, was that they'd become somewhat dehydrated. They couldn't pee for a long time afterwards for the anti-doping, which happens. It's not unusual, obviously, after you've been doing an Ironman in the heat. But when the sort of anecdotal feedback was that there was a good amount of carbohydrate taken throughout the race. But when we broke it down, there was a good amount of carbohydrate taken, but it was predominantly on the bike. So they'd taken over 100 grams an hour on the bike and less than 40 grams an hour on the run, because they'd just got, turned off of the idea of eating gels and just really couldn't stomach gels and things. And so that you can never point to one thing causing slowdown or breakdown in a long distance race. Often, fatigue's involved, glycogen depletion, dehydration can be involved, all sorts of stuff. But in this occasion, and as is so often the case, I think when you analyze the numbers, when you actually get some data and look at it objectively, you can come to a different conclusion as to what's gone wrong. And outside of sport, food is a really emotive issue, and even in races and stuff, people get very het up about what they're eating and drinking. They get very precious about brands and this and that. But really, what you're doing with this gut training, carb capacity testing aspect of the Fuelin app is very, very smart, because what it's doing is it's focusing people on analyzing the numbers, testing it out in training and iterating. And I think that's probably the most powerful thing you can do, rather than go looking for the latest type of gel or the latest type of this or that. There's most of the products out there, and I say that as someone who has a number of products in the market. Most of the products are relatively similar in many ways. They are different amounts of carbohydrate, they're different amounts of sodium, they're different amounts of fluid, but they're the three components. And the magic is in the mix, it's in the mixture as it applies to you and your situation. So this slightly, what you've done with the carb capacity test in the app is make a laborious task a lot easier to do. You've just got to, because now someone's just got to tap those in after a session, it'll work out for them what they've done. You can rate the GI discomfort and then obviously tweak it and move it forward. And I think it gives a tool to make it easy for people to follow that process, which is exactly what we would be advising them to do in the build up to a race.
Yeah, and look, I mean, you can do this on a spreadsheet, as you said. It makes it a little bit less laborious and actually a little bit more enjoyable, because you start to see you're hitting numbers, you start to see the yellow light and the green light go off, and you start to see these numbers that you're recommending, which is, and that we're seeing in the research, these 90 to 120 grams an hour. And I can honestly say, hand on heart, when athletes start hitting these numbers, and you've seen it as well, like, they're different. They're like, wow, I got off the bike and I actually had legs, and they feel fresh. And don't see it as a badge of honor to do all your sessions fasted or without fuel. Like, it serves, in my opinion, it serves very little purpose when it comes to actually racing. And that would be a key takeaway I would take from today's session.
Absolutely.
We'll keep moving on. I know you just touched on some of your products, Andy, and I thought it was really refreshing that you actually said, like, the reality is a lot of these products are similar in terms of the ingredients. There are obviously changes in there, but I mean, I will personally say I was one of the first people to try your Precision Fuel gel, and instantly I liked it because it had no real flavor. And I think, I think I said to you, is it banana flavored or something? And you laughed, but everyone's got a different take on the flavor there. But what is really nice for me, and what I will talk about, what we at Fuelin will talk about with athletes, it's all about palatability. And how did you go about formulating? Was that part of your purpose with the product?
Yeah, it started 10 or 12 years ago with the drinks. What we did with the drinks is we started off with the widest array of flavor profiles we could think of, and we tested them in different conditions, because when you're making a beverage, it's very easy to make a beverage taste good if it's made with nice filtered and chilled water and you're in sensible surroundings. You drink it out of a nice piece of, a piece of glassware and that kind of thing. And the experience of drinking a drink can be so different. So we obviously tested them in a laboratory environment to cut it down to a short list. We tested it in less optimal conditions, and where we really found what works or not is we sat on a bike in a heat chamber and cranked the temperature up, and we used a grotty old warm water bottle, and we drank these drinks for like 2-3 hours on end and that sort of thing. And the resounding feedback that came back from everyone was that at first there were wide discrepancies in what people liked to drink. Some people were very adamant about certain flavors or certain tastes and things, but by you get 2-3 hours in or more, and what people want is something which is like really bland and subtle and inoffensive, and neutral is probably the nicest way to say it. And then we've tried to continue that theme along the vast majority of our products. So naturally these products need, or have, some of them have a little bit of flavor. Our drinks tend to have a very mild citrus blend flavor, which we found tends to work for the vast majority of people, but it's very subtle. The gels, as you pointed out, we made the first iterations of our energy gel in the kitchen, and we tried putting flavors in them, but in the end we just tried the mix, the raw mix without any flavor, and thought, actually, why are we adding a flavor in the first place? It's one less ingredient to put in, and it tastes absolutely fine. It tastes a little bit sweet. We did the same with the chews. We did the same with the drink mix. Has a very slight citrusy flavor like the hydration products, but it's basically all about making something that stays as palatable as it can do for as long as possible, especially in those kind of warm, because it's like you've had a gel in your pocket for like 4 hours on the bike with the sun beating down on it, and it's never going to taste great. What you need it to do is not offend you at that point.
And I think that's, again, it comes back to the athlete trialing these things and practicing it in race conditions, under the type of conditions. So if that's going to be in a hot situation, if you need to manufacture that, then crank up your thermostat in your room. Don't have your fan on. Put it up to the temperature that you're going to be racing in. Have the products at the temperature they're going to end up be at, and then try and consume them, because that whole palatability could be a whole, as you said, consuming something with nice ice cold water out of the fridge. It's a very different situation to actually being on the bike or on the run. So look, I think with your products, I think you've done a really good job with the ingredients are good. I think, you can't argue with the science behind what the ingredients have. And then I think the flavor profile and the actual consistency, they're not super thick, which I like. So
the other point, Scott, which you've got on your diagram as well, is around the amount. It's just, you'll see on all the products, it's very clear how much carbohydrate you're getting, and all the recommendations that tend to come in at 30, 60, 90, 120 grams. We just felt that there was a lack of any clarity in most products to say how much is in a packet. And because that's ultimately what you want to know. You want to know, okay, if it's 90 grams, it's 3 gels, not that it's 4.5 gels or something like that. It seems like a strange way to go.
And I think what we're going to see is a lot of products actually change to 30 grams. I think you're actually slightly ahead, because it makes it easy. Like, the difference being, if, unfortunately, some of the other products which we do recommend are 24 or 25 grams, and suddenly they've got to consume 4 gels instead of 3. Yeah. And it's just one less gel. So it is a consideration for athletes. Obviously, palatability and taste preferences is there, but I think the amount per serving is a really important point as well.
Yeah.
We'll keep moving on.
Yeah.
So look, as we said, something that this is sort of how we think about it at Fuelin is, for in-session fueling, obviously there are some individual variations, gender differences. The reason I bring up gender differences is because females have been shown to experience more GI complaints than men. It's not really well explained, but we just know through the research that women do complain, get upper GI, so that's in relation to gastric emptying from the gut, or lower GI, which is more related to the absorption through the small intestine. So in terms of the way in which we think about it, and I think Andy is fairly similar, have a gel. Now, whether that's caffeinated or uncaffeinated really comes down to preferences. And Andy and I were going to talk about caffeine, but we'll probably leave that to another one, because that's probably a whole hour as well. The reason I tend to say 10 to 15 minutes before is because there is this phenomenon called rebound hypoglycemia. Do you see that a lot, Andy?
It's so we tend to make the same recommendation, but we always would say, you know, based on some trial and error, because there seems to be a percentage of people who do suffer that, where the insulin release that's stimulated by taking something sugary in, if that plus you start exercising, which obviously starts to burn and clear blood sugar quite quickly as well, you can get this big dip. And I haven't got one on today, but I've been wearing a Super Sapiens CGM, and I've almost in myself, like, pretty much comprehensively failed to stimulate rebound hypoglycemia, but other people in our office have managed to do it. And I think there's just that, so there's that individual component to it. The reason we recommend before a long race or a long session getting that extra gel in before the start is really just because it adds, we would count that as the in-race intake, because it basically hits your bloodstream during the race. And
Correct.
It just seems that for an 8, 9, 10 hour Ironman, or, you know, or more, having more carbs, you know, hitting the bloodstream during the race is a good thing. So if it is, as long as there's no detriment to it, then it's worth considering.
Yeah. So just to clarify that, the hypoglycemia, the rebound hypoglycemia, tends to occur when people have some form of carbohydrates about 35, 40 minutes before, and you'll see that drop around 40 minutes. So it is something, as Andy said, like, just practice it. And again, I can't tell you how many athletes never practice having a gel before going and doing a swim session, even though they might do it on race day. So it's not something you have to do all the time, as we touched on before, but I would certainly, you know, if you're going to do a morning swim session, maybe in the car 10 minutes before, have your gel, see how you feel. Do it a couple of times. If everything feels great, then great. If not, and you need to work on that timing, then when you're in that warm-up area before the race, you know exactly when to do it. And I think that's really important. Actually, and something about the Super Sapiens, just so everyone is aware, there's about a 20-minute delay in terms of the recording for the interstitial glucose, just so people are aware of that. If you think that you're going through that hypoglycemic bout and you're doing exercise, you probably will see a rapid drop-off, often with the Super Sapiens sensor, because it has about a 20-minute delay for just the way the technology works. So on the bike, what we tend to recommend, again, for males, if you're trying to get to that 120 grams of carb, then it's probably going to work out around a feed every 15 to 20 minutes. The reason the numbers for the women is maybe a little bit pushed out is because some women won't ever get to that 120 grams, and they may only be pushing somewhere between that 70 and 90 grams an hour. Now, that's obviously can be improved through repetitive training. So those numbers, you know, a professional athlete, Andy and I both work with, Lena Thames, she consumes something every 15 minutes to get to that 120 grams on the bike. But what I would suggest with women is probably just stagger it out a little bit more to start with, and just build up your tolerance with that. And the whole idea of consuming regular and fairly large amounts is, again, this has been shown in the research, you're better off consuming something every 15 to 20 minutes, but a larger volume of carbohydrate, rather than trying to consume something every 5 or 10 minutes, because oxidation rates and GI complaints, respectively, oxidation rates go up and GI complaints actually come down by consuming around 30 grams of carbs per bolus, which I think is a really important factor, and some really cool research that has come out as well. And as I said, that sets you up for the run. You come off the bike, you actually have pretty good legs. And then, you know, again, depending on how fast you are, Andy, I mean, I know they're talking about 90 grams, 120 grams on the run. I've sort of softened on that a lot, and actually said, if people are hitting 120 grams on the bike, especially for a 70.3, I'm more and more comfortable with, like, you know, 50, 60 grams an hour on the run if you're moving really quickly, because the run could finish. I mean, we're seeing athletes finish it in, you know, under, you know, around 80 minutes and stuff like that, and below. And so I'm like, well, you don't need 90 grams an hour. What do you think about that?
So I think this is where there's probably a big difference between half and full Ironman distance, is in the case study data that we've got. It's very common to see people getting high amounts of carbohydrate in on the bike, but also very common to see some really low carbohydrate intake numbers on the run. So one of them, which I think I highlighted to you guys the other day, was with Emma Pallant, who's known as one of the faster runners on the circuit. She's a prolific 70.3 winner, or half iron distance winner, and she sometimes will have as little as like 20 or 30 grams of carbs on the entire run, and she's running for about an hour and a quarter, between 115 and 120 normally. She does a pretty good job of getting some fuel in on the bike, but then really tapers it off. We've seen similar with Sam Appleton, who's again a prolific 70.3 winner in the men's. And because these people are running so fast and they're pretty efficient when it comes to running, they if they get the fueling in on the bike, they can skimp and eke it out a little bit on the run, knowing that they've not, they get 5 or 6 miles in purely on the fuel they've taken on the bike easily, and then it's a case of just maybe a few cups of whatever isotonic sports drink or Coke or something is they can grab on the run. And tactics are coming into play as well, because if they're in a close race or they're trying to push really hard, then they're not going to want to take the time to even take on a gel or something. I think it is a bit different if your race is more measured throughout, and if you're going to be out there on the run course for 1:45, 2 hours, then you need a bit more fuel. Where I would say it's totally different though is on the Ironman, where we see a much stronger trend. Again, this is in the case study, so this isn't like scientifically gathered data, but we're very rigorous in how we gather the data. So I have a reasonable amount of confidence when I talk about these numbers, in that what we're tending to see is the guys and girls that run a very strong marathon will keep their carbohydrate intake relatively high throughout almost the entire duration of the run, because you'll have had to do a good job on the bike, but you can't skimp like you can in a half Ironman in the first third to half of the marathon, because you will get too far into the realms of glycogen depletion and be pretty screwed. So trying to figure out ways to keep those numbers up on the run, which might be using more liquid calories, it might be using more gels. It's certainly very rarely see solids consumed on the run with the faster athletes, that's for sure.
Well, yeah, I mean, I and again, I tried your chews on the run. Yeah. I just couldn't do it. And so like we talk about this with athletes, is like, look, gels are your best. Gels are liquids, small amounts of liquids. Certainly gels are going to be your preferred carbohydrate source on the run, because you can get them down very quickly. Chase it with a cup of water or a bit of Coke, or even, some other type of carbohydrate liquid on the run if you need to. But, you can get them down pretty quick. And I imagine like 90 grams an hour, it's a feed every 25 minutes. And that's very doable for most athletes.
I've also seen, and I think, we don't work with him, but kind of kudos to Lionel Sanders at the Ironman Worlds, where there's a bit of chat about the fact he was bringing the bottle belt back. He was running with his own bottle, because he was clearly, he's had well documented struggles with hydration, and was obviously making a very conscious effort, and took even on a hilly course, thought that the weight penalty of carrying a 24-ounce bottle of fluid was well worth it, in terms of meaning that he could stay on top of that part of his fueling and hydration strategy. And I'm a big believer in the fact that actually, although there is a small weight penalty, and you wouldn't see a professional marathon runner running with a bottle belt, when you're at the back end of an Ironman, especially in the heat, if hydration's your issue, but if fueling is your issue as well, then carrying some of that, either a liquid or carrying some of your own gels or that sort of thing, carrying your own stuff, so you're not having to make tactical decisions at each aid station, is a really good idea. You can then really, he's obviously drinking those bottles, knowing exactly what's in them, how much is in them, and then keeping to some sort of schedule. And I think that's really smart. If you feel like either the energy intake or the hydration intake is going to be an Achilles heel, don't be afraid to carry some of your own nutrition and hydration on the run.
Yeah, no, I'd 100% agree with that. So let's. I know we're running out of time, and I don't want to run out of time for Q&A, and I think we probably will get very tight and maybe go a little bit over, as long as everyone's okay with that. I think what we're seeing at the moment, obviously, everyone's talking about the numbers in session fueling, but I think athletes need to be very aware about that. Proper fueling before and after training is really important. There's a lot of talk of REDs at the moment. you know, and low energy availability, and the possibility, the negative health impact of that when not fueling appropriately. So I think it's really important that athletes do acknowledge that, you know, and what does appropriate fueling look like? We can touch on that, but certainly making sure that protein for endurance athletes is on point. And when we talk about protein, don't be afraid of taking in quite a lot of protein, and certainly around, you know, anywhere between 1.8 and 2.5 grams per kilo body weight of protein is going to be very beneficial in terms of improving recovery, improving potentially muscle soreness, but certainly that ability to maintain muscle mass. You probably during the season are not going to build significant amount of muscle, but what you don't want to be doing is losing any significant amounts of muscle. Protein will certainly have an impact. Increased amounts of protein can have a positive impact on improved immune function. We know that during a season, high load in endurance athletes will make you more susceptible to upper respiratory tract infections. So keeping protein up is very important, and certainly for the female athletes out there, be very aware of your bone mineral density. And again, protein can assist with that, along with your total caloric intake. So in terms of establishing what your caloric intake is, there is equations to doing this, but certainly in the way in which you're going to be thinking about carbohydrates, fats, and protein, you're probably aiming for around 1.8 to, as I said, 2.5 grams per kilo body weight of protein. For fat, depending on your purpose, whether it is trying to reduce body weight or improve body composition, you're going to be somewhere between 0.8 grams and, depending on training volume, anywhere up to 1.5, maybe a little bit higher than that, grams per kilo body weight. And then your total carbohydrate amount. Look, I'm not a believer in ketogenic diets for endurance athletes. I think certainly around 2.5 grams of carbs would be, you know, there or thereabouts, probably the lower end of where I'd be recommending. And certainly as you get into high training loads where you're going over that 10 hours, getting into 15 hours and above 20 hours, you've got to then apply a factor to those total amount of carbs that you're taking in. And certainly on high volume training days, multiple sessions, you're certainly looking at over 5 grams per kilo body weight of carbohydrates. And again, think of carbohydrates as not just gels, blocks, the liquids that Andy's company produces. You have to remember that vegetables, fruit, these are sources of carbohydrates and should be utilized in large volumes. The relative glycemic load of those types of foods is going to impact the amount of carbohydrates that it provides you with. So those lower glycemic load foods, think cruciferous vegetables, a lot of leafy greens, they're going to provide you with a lot more fiber, but lower density in carbohydrates, versus as you go up into moderate and high glycemic foods, they're probably going to have less fiber, but certainly provide you with more carbohydrates. So you can think of potatoes, sweet potatoes, rice, pasta, noodles, and things like that. And so, yeah, you certainly want to be thinking about the composition of your diet. So I think there is a big focus on macronutrients at the moment. But when you are hitting your macros, think about the quality of your diet as well. And I think that's a really important point. Do you want to add anything to that, Andy?
No, I think just to say that I think the way that the technology that you guys have got at Fuelin and what we've got with the Fuelin hydration planner, it's kind of a good complement there, because clearly, you know, I said to you before this call, your overall rounded perspective on nutrition is far bigger than mine. My background is physiology and an understanding of the fueling and hydration during exercise, but I tend, you know, I certainly try to stay in my lane when it comes to day-to-day nutrition. I take an active interest in that, but I'm not qualified in it. And I think that's where, like most people, I think that's where the Fuelin app is a useful tool for accountability and education around all of that supporting nutrition, because as athletes, you know, you can be very guilty, and we certainly are very focused on talking about what I'm eating during hard training sessions and during races. But clearly, when you take a pace back, that is a small piece of the overall nutrition puzzle. So that's where I think, you know, the Fuelin website, the tools, the educational materials you've got, and the way that the system works is very, very good for helping people get that massive part of the puzzle right.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I really appreciate that. And I think like what we're trying to do is, yeah, not scare people with food. I think there is this, I don't know if you've seen it, but there certainly is this fear mongering around. And I think it might have been because of some of that research which came out about fasted training. And obviously there's a big focus on intermittent fasting. Certainly in America, we see this. I don't know, in the UK, in Australia, it's been pretty popular as well, where people aren't necessarily thinking of the context of the research, and they're looking at the results of time restricted fasting in particular, or intermittent fasting, and thinking, oh, this is great, it certainly can improve certain health measures. But what they're not looking at is the populations being studied, which majority of the time is obese or certainly very unhealthy, overweight individuals, adults. And if you're a triathlete or endurance athlete, you have to think, why are you doing fasted training? At just period. Why do you want to do fasted training when it could have significant negative impacts on your health in the long run if it is continued over and over again? And I think, you know, I don't know where you stand on that, Andy, in terms of
exactly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just paste the link into the channel, because we just, funnily enough, put together a blog on that very subject, because we get asked about it all the time around the difference. It's kind of that dichotomy of like, I want to fuel to perform, but I'm also trying to either manage body weight or whatever. And I think, yeah, we put together a blog on it, but the summary of that really is the same as you, is that there appears to be very limited cases where training in a fasted state is useful. And if anything, the risks outweigh the benefits. There are other ways to achieve the same ends. And I sort of, in that blog, talk a little bit about my own personal experience with that, when I was trying to drop weight as an athlete and that kind of thing, and kind of doing it in many ways all of the wrong way, because you fail to maintain the intensity of training that you're trying to achieve, because the temptation is to skimp on the calories on the longest and hardest sessions that you're doing. Which then becomes counterproductive. It leads to illness and breakdown and all those sort of things. So, yeah, I think that's worth a dive into. But I would say that we're pretty aligned on the philosophy there. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I think it is that point about intensity. You just need to remember, as an athlete, if you don't eat something before, then we know that, you know, your rate of perceived exertion is probably going to go up, and your potential to push out total numbers is probably going to go down, despite what you might think anecdotally. We know that if it was in a lab setting, that's probably going to be the case. So it is something to think about in terms of pre-session fueling on top of your in-session fueling, and then certainly post-session fueling. Again, this sort of fits in with the total program of what are you trying to achieve as an individual. You know, if your goal is performance versus your goal is body comp, there is going to be a difference in terms of the total amounts of carbohydrates that you're probably going to take on. Keeping in mind, if you've got a second session as well, certainly don't be afraid of carbohydrates if that second session is going to be of significant intensity and of significant duration. You don't want to be going into that second session with, you know, poor fuel on board, because the likelihood is the risk of injury is going to be actually significantly increased. And then I thought what we'd just show is, you know, as we said with Andy, like the way in which we're trying to do this is to provide you with very practical ways to manage your fueling before, during, and after, and doing that in what we call a traffic light system, which, as you touched on, Andy, with James Morton and his group, where they talked about the fuel for the work required. So, you know, in this case, you can see this individual has a fairly intense brick session. We know that it's an intense session because they've got a Z3 score, which is an intensity of race or above. They're going to be recommended to, you know, consume fairly high amounts of carbohydrates In this case, this is a male, so every 15 to 20 minutes, aiming to consume around 30 grams of carbs with that goal of getting up to close to 120 grams an hour. And then with the run off the bike, again, one gel every roughly 15 to 20 minutes, depending on what their capacity is. But what's really important, as you can see there, is that they're being instructed, you know, before a swim session in the morning to actually have a moderate amount of carbohydrates, which, you know, in this case is simply, you know, some toast with some almond butter jelly. A snack as simple as that in a whole food form can be really beneficial to the athlete. And then with something like breakfast, again, focusing on whole foods, but aiming for around 100, you know, 100 to 150 grams of carbs before going out and doing a session where the coach is actually wanting them to actually lay it down and produce significant amounts of power on the bike, and then obviously do a really impressive run off the bike and actually record that to the coach. So I think the overriding thing here is just what athletes need to be aware of is that food is really important if you want to perform at your absolute best. And then I think, look, in terms of the way the program works, it does sync with today's plan, and it does sync with Training Peaks, which I think is quite unique in that it's actually going to provide them with, you know, fuel such as yours, Andy, like your gels, your blocks, and your liquid carbs and your electrolytes to actually, and as we showed with the carbohydrate capacity testing, but also the sweat testing component, actually get athletes working towards customizing what they can actually do. And I think that's a really important part of this. And going back to what you said about be your own scientist, have yourself as n=1, and perform mini experiments on yourself so that you learn how much carbs can you take in, at what intensity, how often, how frequent, what types of products are going to allow you to actually not have GI complaints. And yeah, that's probably what I'll say about that. I think from the key takeaways from this, I think we're seeing research that, you know, is absolutely supporting your products, Andy. And I think what you're doing is really great in that you're producing very simple products that taste really great and are really palatable, and then are allowing athletes to replicate what we're seeing in the research now and what you've probably seen in your own testing. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, we're trying to provide basically the sort of the backbone of a plan with the fueling and hydration planner to give you an idea of how much carbohydrate, how much fluid, how much sodium you might need per hour for the activity that you're undertaking, and then a toolkit, or someone actually called it today on a phone call I had with an athlete, they called it the Lego kit of, you know, you've got the gels with 30 grams or the chews with 30 grams, you've got the electrolyte tablets of a different strength, and you just pick the components, you put them together, and you make up those numbers. So we're trying to simplify it, as you said with the title of this talk, demystify it, really. You know your carbohydrate, fluid, and sodium numbers, have a simple way to hit them, and then your final bullet point on that top bit, and then, you know, train your gut to get up to the level that is compatible with the performance that you desire is the last step with it, really. So trying to keep it super simple like that.
Yep. No, absolutely. Okay. Well, let's I know there's been a few questions. Mark Woodrow, I know you asked about the larger ingestion of carbohydrates. That's Steve Mears, MEARS, and his colleagues at Loughborough Uni. That's where they did the studies with larger volumes versus smaller volumes of liquid carbohydrates. I think it was done with runners, but then they've talked about it with gels and looking at reduced GI complaints, but increased carbohydrate oxidation rates. Andy, there's a couple of questions here. Your thoughts on mixing gels in a bottle with water? Yeah,
we don't recommend it as the first line, you know, as the best thing to do. The main reasons for that are it can be difficult to keep track of how much you're having per hour or whatever. And if you drop a bottle or something like that, which has got the vast majority of your nutrition for the entire race in it, or the entire bike ride, it can lead to problems. That being said, that's definitely one of those areas where we've softened and sort of changed our stance over the years, because we see so many athletes doing it. What we end up doing is helping people to do it and do it right. And I would say what it is a very efficient way to carry a lot of carbohydrate or a lot of your nutrition in one place. So we're increasingly seeing athletes at a high level doing it. And I think as long as you practice with it, as long as you are comfortable with it, as long as you can start to get an idea of what is a mouthful of gel, how many mouthfuls have I got to get through a bottle, how many gels exactly are in there. And if the worst case happens, if you drop it, you know, how are you going to make that up by picking stuff up on the course? Then it's a perfectly workable strategy. All of those caveats just need to be understood before you just lob a load of gels in the bottle and give it a go on race day. You want to be doing that in training, you know, like we've said about all the other things. The last thing you want is, for example, to find out the gel mix is too viscous and you can't get it out through the bottle lid very easily. That race day is not the time to find that out. So
yeah. I've softened on it a lot, Andy. Actually, one of an athlete we were working with, he was like, you know, he saw a pro doing this and he was like, I want to try it. And his brother's actually a pro athlete, and he said a lot of them are doing this now. So we started playing around with it, and it works really well with your products. If people are out there using Morton gels, please don't add water to them, because it becomes a thick mess and it ruins, because of the hydrogel with the not arginine, what is it, pectin alginate in it. If you mix water with it, you literally, they become horrible. So don't waste your Morton gels if you are doing that. I think to that point, Andy, like, use a clear bottle, put marks on it. Definitely. Practice at home, squeeze the amount into your mouth, spit it into a measuring cup, work out if it is 30 grams, like all those little things. It's all that practice, isn't it? You become your own scientist, and it's working really well. You know, you mentioned the point about don't drop, or if you drop your bottle, I mean, I've had athletes say, I'm like, just don't drop it. Hold on to it pretty tight.
We had one in one of the case studies with Leon Chevalier, who did that in Ironman Mallorca. His bottle bounced out early in the bike ride. Luckily, he's a clever guy. He knew how much he'd lost. He picked up a load of extra gels on the course, made up for it, and still went on to win the race. So, you know, but he had to have a good handle on what he then had to just, and he had freely admitted it was a source of quite a lot of anxiety and stress for a while he figured it out and got into it. So, but you know, you can make arguments for and against. I think that's one of those, it's one of those things where if you're prepared to practice it and nail the logistics of it, physiologically speaking, there's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. We've got another question about when should you start fueling with carbs on the bike? What's your thoughts on that, Andy? I know I have some thoughts on it, but
yeah, I think honestly, it depends how hard you've had to work in the swim and those sort of things. Sometimes there are reasons to wait a few minutes and settle down and settle into it, especially if the dynamics of the bike, if you're someone who's racing and vying for position and that sort of thing. And on the whole, though, what I would say is that honestly, the earlier you can start fueling, the better generally. What I wouldn't be doing, though, is forcing it down if you really are still hyperventilating and feeling like you're getting your heart rate down and recovering from the swim. The fitter you get, the more condition you get at racing, the better you should become at that. But, you know, and there's all sorts of practical applications as well. You're doing a bike course where you go straight out T1 and up a massive climb, then that's going to influence the decision versus if you're rolling out into a nice flat freeway. So, but
I think that's so, you're absolutely bang on there, Andy. Like, look at the course. There is no hard and fast rule here. I mean, one thing I tend to talk about athletes is you're going from a horizontal position in the swim to slightly more upright. And sometimes that can take a little bit of time just to settle in. So I would tend to say 15 minutes, give yourself some time. Same with the run. Like, just give yourself 15 minutes, 20 minutes. You're not going to bonk like in 20 minutes. Like, don't panic. Like, just let yourself settle into it, hey? And like, if the course has a hill right at the start, okay, depending on how big that climb is, if you need some fuel, you need a little kick, maybe rinse your mouth with some carbohydrate, swish it around the mouth for 10 seconds, spit it out. It could have that physiological effect on the brain, as we know with mouth carbohydrate mouth rinse. If you need something, go for it. But if you're happy to settle into it, just settle in, let your body just relax, as you said, like, come out of the swim, feel good, get on the bike, get in your rhythm, and then go from there.
Yeah. I've spotted a couple of questions up
Yeah.
there. Actually, one was asking about our planner. Is the sodium level shown per hour or for the race duration? I assume that was when you were putting your slide out. They are mostly shown on the summary screen in a per hour, on a per hour basis. But what you couldn't see from Scott's screenshot is that if you hover and click on those, it'll expand out and give you more detail. But most of the stuff's per hour. And then the other one below that was from Pam, and Althea was asking about the Precision Fuel and Hydration gels isotonic. No, they're not. They're hypertonic, so they've got quite a high carbohydrate content to weight ratio. So generally, like most gels, you will use them with a drink. I've actually found in cold conditions, they're not very sticky because we use pectin to gel them. You can take them on their own without water, but ultimately you're going to need to take some water or a drink alongside them at some point, especially in the heat.
Yeah, just on that point, and I know we haven't really touched on sweating and that, we'll probably do another one on that. I think that point about it's milligrams per liter as opposed to milligrams per hour, and I think the important point about that, Pam, is because it depends on your fluid intake. If your fluid intake is really low, but you're continuing to take in, say, 1,000 milligrams of sodium based on that 1,000 milligrams per liter, but you only take in 500 mils, suddenly you're actually taking in 2,000 milligrams instead of the equivalent of 2,000 as opposed to 1,000. So it is something really important to think about, is the fluid intake has to match the milligrams of sodium taking in. And we will show that in another talk where we'll demonstrate, what happens when sodium intake is balanced but fluid intake is not, and what can happen potentially to an athlete.
Yeah, that is a good point. You've kind of you've done a way better job of explaining that than I did, Scott. And that's why if people click into the case studies, we show the amount of fluid, the amount of sodium, and also what that looks like in terms of relative sodium concentration, because you do sometimes see people hitting what look like reasonable numbers in one or the other, but the actual relative concentration, they might on a hot day take a lot of sodium in, but if they drink way more water, actually what they've taken in is very, very dilute. Or it can go the opposite way. If you take a lot of sodium in tablet form and not a lot of water, you can be really off the charts with how high the relative concentration is. So keeping in mind that those two things are sort of not coupled irrevocably, but they are somewhat coupled, is really important.
Yeah, no, I think it's such a fascinating area around the hydration element, and I think it would be a really good one for us to talk about at another time. I know we're a little bit over. I'm sorry everyone for talking over. I know there was another question about carb loading prior to an event. Such a big topic. I actually just recently wrote an article about this in Triathlete magazine. It was in the hard copy, but also online. I don't think it's paywalled anymore, so you can read that. I think that the take-home message for me, certainly with carb loading, is that you want to be doing it. I think there would be I can't think of a scientific reason why you wouldn't start to carb load. You certainly don't need to do it for days and days on end. You don't need to do glycogen depleting exercise prior to it. 24 to 48 hours of carb loading, certainly with women, not looking at a percentage of total caloric intake. You want to be looking at grams per kilo. So for women, certainly looking at 8 to 10 grams per kilo body weight for carbohydrate intake would make sense based on the research. For men, certainly somewhere around that 8 to 10 grams as well is going to make a difference. The point of all this high carb fueling in is that what we know now in the research as well is that by taking in high amounts of carbohydrate in session, what it does is keep your blood glucose stable and possibly spare your glycogen stores for when the duration of the exercise becomes so long that the ability to actually match the rate at which you're expending energy can't be matched. And so then you start tapping into your muscle glycogen. And so the point of the high carb fueling is to potentially offset that so that you give yourself enough time to actually finish the race in a good position. Is that how you would explain it, Andy? I didn't explain that very well.
On a practical side, I would say that the carb loading pre-event is all about stocking your muscles and your liver to an extent, but mainly your muscles full of that, the fuel that they're going to draw on.
And the liver.
Inevitably, that's going to decline throughout the course of the event. By keeping high carbs going in during the event, I've demonstrably seen it when I've done long duration exercise wearing a CGM, and I've seen, and it's generally seems to be that when I see that level of blood sugar maintained fairly consistently throughout a long session or a race, that is compatible with better performance and certainly better feeling. You definitely feel better at that point. And as you say, that's potentially sparing some of the muscle glycogen. The muscle glycogen is going to decline, whatever, because that's getting burned throughout the activity. Yep. But if you can just attenuate that burn and by high carb fueling, and if you've started with much fuller tanks because of carb loading, you often are operating within the safety zone the whole way, and you don't blow up. Basically, if you blow up, one of those two things is fallen off the tracks.
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, I know we're about 20 minutes over, so apologies to everyone. If everyone is fine with that, if there's no more questions, we can close it off.
What I will do is I can put our I'll put our email address in the chat, so if anyone wants to talk to
hello@precisionhydration.com. Is that a good one there?
That one works, or we've also got another domain there, a bit shorter, pfandh.com. So, but either will get through to us. And if anyone's got any direct questions, please feel free to email us, and we'll follow up.
Yeah, look, I think, Andy, hopefully everyone found this useful. I always enjoy chatting with you and hearing what you've got to say about the latest research and what you're seeing, in your area of expertise. I think obviously a lot of the participants today have come from Precision, so we're very grateful. So what we said was that anyone who was thinking about joining Fuelin, either on the what we call the autopilot or co-pilot, if they use Precision 20, they'll get 20% off that first month as a thank you for coming on today and listening to us. Certainly everyone check out precisionhydration.com. And you'll see all their products. I think the sweat rate and the fueling guideline feature that they've created recently is fantastic. I think it's a really nice way of giving people a very good start in hopefully fueling yourself and keeping yourself hydrated correctly. And as I said, I think Andy's products are very, very good, and certainly our athletes use them in abundance and have radically changed their fueling approach as a result of that. So thank you. And then obviously our website, fuelin.com, check it out, have a look. And everyone out there, please feel free to follow us and Andy on social media, on Instagram and Facebook and all those sorts of fun things that we do.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jonathan and Scott, for the invite to participate in this, and for everyone giving up some time to come and listen to us.
Cool. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Andy.
Look, please feel free to fill in the questionnaire at the end of this. Your honest feedback would be fantastic. And if you do want future sessions, certainly I'd love to do another one with Andy talking about hydration and his products and electrolytes. We'd certainly love to cover that one, but if you've got other things, then please let us know. Cool. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.